Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the crucifixion in our continuing study of the life of Christ. Matthew 27:27, when the soldiers of the governor took Jesus, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium. Praetorium is just a term for the official residence, and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. I've noticed before that the word Roman isn't there. In this case, I think it is the Roman cohort. Not necessarily every time you see that word cohort, it could be a Jewish cohort. Context is going to help you determine which it is. Verse 28, they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Now, what they're doing is they're mocking him, but it's rather striking. They're mocking him by giving him the ornaments, the mocking ornaments of a king. And what they are unintentionally doing is they are pointing to the fact that Jesus is king, and he is seen in his kingship as he goes to die for his subjects. Verse 30, they spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. So now we're going to move to the crucifixion. Verse 26, this is Luke's account. When they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene is in North Africa to the west of Egypt. But he was coming in from the country and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. The Roman authorities had the authority and the right, whether it was legal or not, to take anyone for any reason and to give them a burden, to force them into service. Roman governorship, Roman rule could be a bit harsh and a bit heavy-handed, and that's what takes place here. Now, Mark's account, Mark is giving the parallel passage, Mark chapter 15, verse 21. They pressed into service a passerby coming in from the country, same name, Simon of Cyrene. But notice, Mark notes that this is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why would Mark give us that additional detail? I think it's likely that Alexander and Rufus were known or could be known both to Mark and to the readers. Why would this be? Why would they know the children of this man who was pressed into service? Because he was pressed into service, but he becomes, and maybe his children also become believers. They become Christians in this chance encounter with Jesus and these Roman soldiers. Verse 27, and following him was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. So there were those that were going to be mocking him, but there were also those who took exactly the opposite point of view, that were mourning, that were lamenting over this decision. Verse 28, but Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Now, if those words look familiar, they ought to be. First of all, you're going to see them eventually in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 6, where the kings of the earth and the mighty men, and they say to the mountains, fall on us, and the hills cover us, almost word for word. But also when you read about it in Revelation chapter 6, you're supposed to have the reaction, wait a minute, that looks vaguely familiar from the Old Testament. And back in the Old Testament, it was sort of a similar story in the book of Joshua chapter 10, where this confederation of pagan kings come up against Israel. And you remember the story, God gets into the fight, and God is casting down great hailstones from the sky. So there's more people killed by the falling stones than are killed by the actual battle. And this is the same day where Joshua commands the sun to stand still, and it does it. and the moon to stand still, and it does it. Now, I don't know how God did that, but at the end of that passage, those kings that had been against the people of God and were defeated, they were discovered hiding in a cave, and it didn't do them any good. They were eventually brought out and executed. But this idea of going to hide under the mountains and hide under the hills. Verse 31, for if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it's dry? If they're doing these things at the best of times, what's it going to look like at the worst of times? And notice it's the Jewish leaders that are playing out the part of those pagan kings. Verse 32, two others also, who were criminals, were being led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place called the skull. Now, you can look at that word, the skull. In Latin, you would say Calvary. In Hebrew, you would say Golgotha. There's actually a similar name of a place in Rome. In Rome, there's if you know anything about Rome, Rome is a city built on 7 hills, and one of those hills is the Capitoline Hill. And another way of saying that is the hill of the skull. In fact, we're told in Roman history that the reason that hill had its name wasn't because it was shaped like a skull, was because traditionally there had been this ancient skull that had been found there, and so that was somehow associated with a place. How did this place called the skull, how did it get its name? We're not told. Now, it's interesting that way back in 1 Samuel chapter 17, remember that's the story of David and Goliath. And David had defeated Goliath and then had taken Goliath's sword and cut off Goliath's head. And there's one verse in that chapter that tells about how David, presumably at a later date, we don't really know when, but he had taken the skull of Goliath to Jerusalem. And I can't help but wonder, is this how this place got its name? I don't know. That's pure speculation. But in any case, they take him to this place called the Skull, where they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today, one of the places that they will take you is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Tradition has it, and tradition can be sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. I don't know if that's the case here, but tradition has it that the place of the skull was here. Now, the tradition goes all the way back to the 300s AD. So that's a very early tradition. And unfortunately, instead of leaving it how it looks today, they built this big giant church over top of it. It's been through several renditions, and notice in the artwork it shows what the hill might have looked like, and then what the tomb. And there are some very early tombs. That's not the only one. In fact, over behind it, one of the reasons I like to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that behind the tomb that they allege is Christ's tomb, there are at the back of the church, and you have to sort of look for it because a lot of people don't know that it's even there. There are several other tombs cut into the rock, and they're very early. I don't know if they're 1st century, but they're very, very early, probably going to around that time. And here was a new tomb. Here's a picture of what that looks like today. Like I said, they've cut all the rock away from most of it. You can go into the back and still see some early tombs, and unfortunately, they cut it away and they made it into a big church. I rather wish they would have just left it the way it was, but they didn't do that. Here's the glass case. Notice you see a rock. Under that rock is the top of what they felt was this mountain, this hill known as the Skull Hill or Golgotha or Calvary. That you can just say the same place name in 3 different languages. And frankly, you look at it and you just see all the gold and the ornaments, and that really doesn't do much for me. But that very possibly, I think, is the location, a very early tradition. Now, if you go to the north of Jerusalem, there's another place. There was he was a military officer by the name of Gordon. I guess he visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and much like myself, he said, "Gee, I wish they hadn't done that." And he thought, "I wonder if there's another place that looks like a skull." And so, if you use your imagination and you go to what's called Gordon's Calvary, it's located north of the city. Present-day Jerusalem is actually inside that part of the city, but it wasn't in the city in Jesus' day. It was quite a bit further north of the city. Um, and so if you use your imagination today, and notice there's a bus parked nearby, it's actually a bus depot that's right alongside of it. Um, and so a lot of folk think maybe this was the site. I don't think it was. I think it's way too far north of the city to be the site. But they have built a nice park there, and even though I don't think it's the site, I do urge people to go there and reflect about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. There is a tomb there. It dates to earlier than the first century. Remember, Jesus was laid in a brand new tomb, so it wouldn't have been the tomb he was laid in, even if this was the general site. Here's a map showing both those areas. First, we look at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Notice it would have been right outside the walls. You say, wait a minute, what about that green wall? That green wall wasn't there yet. It would be added by Herod Agrippa the First, sometime between 41 and 44 AD. And so this was located right outside the walls of the city, right outside the gates. And I think probably if either one of those places is correct, and maybe neither one is, but if either one is correct, this is probably it. The other location is off our map, so I can't really show it on this map because it's so far north of the city. And so that's Gordon's tomb, which is off the map. Here's the model. This model of Jerusalem is located at the Scroll Museum in Jerusalem. Now, the Herodian Palace we talked about in a previous class. I believe this is probably where the trials both Pilate and Herod Antipas were held here. This would be the nice part of the city, the nice quarters, as opposed to the Antonia Fortress. Um, and so you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Notice again the wall that surrounds that. That wall wasn't there in Jesus' day. It wasn't added until after Jesus' day. And then way up in the north would be Gordon's Calvary, and so that's way up to the north. Next, we would want to look at the chronology of events, and by that I mean the time element when things are taking place. Notice that Pilate pronounces his sentence upon Jesus at the sixth hour. Now, is that 6 hours after sunrise? That would be, around noon, if that were the case. And you say, well, wait a minute, I thought Jesus was crucified earlier than that, according to the synoptic accounts. I think what John is doing is that he switched over to Roman time, where and my opinion is all throughout John's gospel account, John is using Roman time similar to what we refer to, so that we refer to 6 in the morning or six. I don't think it's 6 in the evening. I think this is 6 in the morning, where Pilate pronounces his sentence upon Jesus, and of course the times are estimate. Notice how everything takes place in increments of 3. The 6th hour, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour. They didn't have clocks. They couldn't pull out their cell phone and say, "Gee, it's 7:46." So they're rounding things off to the nearest quarter of a day or half a day or something like that. Um, and so Jesus is crucified according to Mark chapter 15 and verse 25. At the 3rd hour, I think this is speaking in typical Jewish fashion, the 3rd hour after sunrise. And remember, they hadn't said, gee, it's 1, 2, 3 hours. The sun is up a bit by the time Jesus is on the cross. And then at the 6th hour, again, this is going to be Jewish time, what we would think of as noon. We're going to see darkness coming over all the land. And those passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that it's going to be until the 9th hour. So around 3 hours. Remember, we're guesstimating the time. So from the time the sun would normally be overhead, but instead of being overhead, the sun's going to be darkened. Now, what kind of darkening was that? I don't know. We're not told. Not a traditional solar eclipse because it's the wrong time of the month for that. And then the death of Jesus will be around the ninth hour. That's according to Matthew 27, verse 46. And so roughly around 3 p.m. Now, crucifixion was considered a dishonorable death, where the person being crucified would be stripped down, perhaps completely naked, um, and then exposed for all the world to see. And remember, this is an honor and shame culture where crucifixion and nakedness and these are all dishonorable things. And then over his head would be, or maybe affixed to the side of his cross, would be a note saying the crimes for which somebody was being crucified. Back in the 1960s, the bones of a man, Jewish man, were discovered in Israel. Now, the actual bone that was discovered is, notice on the right, you say, that doesn't look much like a bone. Oh, well, I'm not a medical doctor, so I wouldn't be able to tell one bone from another, but medical doctors were able to determine this was the ankle bone. So what you have on the left is a reproduction of what that bone would have looked like if it was attached to its foot where it belonged. And notice the spike that was found wasn't going from the top end of the foot, but through the heel. Now, I don't care how you do it. It's going to be painful, but I just find myself cringing when I look at this, at the pain that would have been involved. And it also reminds me of a passage back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 that speaks of the seed of the woman and his heel being bruised. And I think, oh my goodness, this took place literally in the case of Jesus, if that's how they did it. And I'm not saying for certain that they did, but they did in this case. This is at least one possible practice. Now, once Jesus is on the cross, we're going to have between all four gospel accounts, we'll look at them in order first, and then we'll look at them by the gospel accounts. Luke chapter 23, verse 34, has the prayer of Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, where he asks forgiveness, not just on the behalf of those that are mourning and weeping and are with him, but those who are against him, the very religious leaders who came up against him. Jesus prays for them and perhaps gives us a way to pray as well when people do wrong against us. Secondly, where Jesus speaks to the thief on the cross who was with him. And initially, we read in one of the accounts, they were both castigating and speaking evil of him. But then as he's on the cross, one of the thieves undergoes a change of heart. And he says to his companion, we deserve to be here. We're here because we have done criminal acts, terrible acts. But this is a righteous man. And then he turns to the Lord and he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replies to him. Now, I'm going to read this twice because I'm going to put the emphasis differently. And in the Greek text, you can read it either way. Now, in our English translations usually put some punctuation that direct our reading, and that's okay. I actually think they have it right. But I'm going to read it twice. First of all, I tell you today, you're going to be with me in paradise. Now, notice how I put the today with, I tell you today. You can actually read it that way in the Greek text. I think the better way to read it is probably the way most of our translations have put it with the punctuation and they place a comma there. I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. You say, well, why do you think that's going to happen on that day? And the reason why is because of all the other times, and there's not that many times, but I looked up every other time Luke has Jesus using the word today. And I think that's probably what's taking place here. You're just comparing the scriptures and comparing the way Jesus speaks and comparing the way Luke describes Jesus speaking. So I think what's happening is he's saying, look, we're here right now, but before the day ends, both of us, you will be with me in paradise. Now, of course, paradise is that it's sort of a late word. It's a loan word from actually comes from the Persians. Um, and it was their way of describing heaven, and it had been adopted and used to describe as another term for heaven. Next, Jesus turns to his mother who was there, and with her was a disciple who is described in John's gospel account as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And she turns to her, and he addresses her and says, "Behold, woman, behold your son." Now remember, woman was one of the things that he had said to her way back in John chapter 2 at the wedding feast of Canaan. Woman, my hour is not yet come. Well, now his hour had come. And so he says, "Woman, behold your son." And then he turns to him, "Son, behold your mother," as if to say, you treat her as though she is your mother, because I'm not going to be there in the flesh to do that any longer. You take that responsibility upon yourself, and turns to her and says, and you look to him as though he were your son. He will take care of you. He will meet your needs. He will be me on behalf of my absence. Now think about that. There are times when we're called to be Jesus to somebody else, because Jesus isn't here in the flesh. He's not here physically, but he has left us here instead. And there are times where we're called to represent Jesus actively by doing those things for others that Jesus would have done were he here. Next, we have his call from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a quote from Psalm 22, speaking to his separation, his I think something was taking place there, something spiritual, where it's as though the Father turned his back on the Son who, not just all his earthly life, but through all eternity, had enjoyed fellowship with the Father. And yet suddenly, in this instance, in time and space upon the cross, the Son is being treated as though he is fatherless. And the sky turns black, as if all creation averted its gaze. Next we have, and this is John recording this, he says the words, "I thirst." Because after all, he had been through a lot and nobody was giving him anything, to drink. And the Roman soldiers went and got uh, a sponge, and they put some vinegar on it, which would be oftentimes used to, from what I understand, to deaden the pain. And he tasted it, and no, he wasn't going to deaden the pain. When he realized what it was, then he turned his head away, but did not take that. Now remember, John's account has talked about Jesus standing up and says, "If anyone will come to me, I will give him living water." He thirsted. He went thirsty so that we could drink of him and have our spiritual thirst satisfied. And finally, as he's on the cross, this is also in John's account, he says a single Greek word, and it takes 3 words to say this in English, "It is finished." Actually, probably more correct would be, "It has been finished," is the perfect tense in the Greek. Something that's taken place in the past with continuing results. Completed, finished. The Greek word there is tetelestai, as if to say the work is completed. It has been done and need not be repeated. And then finally, and Luke records this, he turns to his Father, the same Father to whom he had said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But now he can say, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he willingly dies. Notice, I commit my spirit, not that people took his life from him, but that he gives it up and gives himself into the hands of his Father. Now we're going to look at those same 7 expressions, but I want to note which of the gospel accounts say which one. So for example, in Matthew and Mark, the only statement that is said there is the quote from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? As if to underscore that aspect, the fact that he was treated as a sacrifice abandoned by God so that we would not be abandoned by God. And that's Matthew and Mark. They agree on that. Luke, by contrast, has several sayings. First of all, and we've already seen the significance of these, but I want to put them together to see what Luke is pointing out. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He says to the priest, truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. And then finally, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now, Luke's emphasis is in ministering to others, and that's the point that he makes in the first two of these, where Jesus came to minister to others, to be the Savior of men, and so he prays for those who are crucifying him. That's a ministry to others. And then he ministers to the thief that is on the cross with him. Truly, I tell you today, actually, let me just rephrase that. Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. I think that's the correct way to say it. He ministers to that thief. He ministers to those that did not recognize him. He ministers to the one that did recognize him. And then he turns to the Father and receives ministry as he commits his spirit into the hands of the Father. That is Luke's emphasis. John's emphasis, remember we said that John speaks both to Mary and to the disciple whom Jesus loved. He says to her, woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. And these remind us of what had taken place earlier, going back all the way to John chapter 2 with the wedding feast. This is not a wedding now, but it is a family connection. Now think about this. At a wedding, you have a new family being formed. And Jesus is making a new family here, as illustrated by this disciple whom Jesus loved and Mary becoming now a family. And of course, we have entered into a family relationship with Jesus. By his death on the cross, we enter a family relationship. And then he says, I thirst. Again, that harkens back, I've already mentioned this, harkens back to what Jesus said both to the Samaritan woman and also in John chapter 7 when he was at the Feast of Tabernacles in the temple. And he said, if anyone will come to me, out of his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. He becomes thirsty so that we can drink. And then he says, it is finished, as if to say, the work has been accomplished. The hour has come. It is done. The work indeed is completed. Matthew 27 records, and in verse 51, behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the veil of the temple was this big, giant affair, and it was out of reach. It was a big, tall veil. And notice the tearing was not something that you could do from the bottom up, from the top down, that, as if to say, God is the one who tore the veil of the temple. And the veil of the temple was what separated the temple proper from the innermost part of the temple. You see, as in the picture you're looking at, you're seeing the temple, and you had the lampstands on the one side and the tables of showbread on the other. In the original temple, that had only had one lampstand and one table of showbread, the Herod's temple had gotten considerably bigger, following the outline of Zerubbabel's temple. And so instead of just one lampstand, they had put a number of them, a number of tables, one altar of incense. But behind the veil, that was the Holy of Holies. That was the very presence of God. Nobody was allowed to go there except once a year, and that only on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, and then only the high priest. But now the veil is torn from top to bottom, as if to say, entrance has been given to everyone. You can go into the presence of God through what Christ accomplished on our behalf. And notice the earth shook and the rocks were split. the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints, now Matthew's the only one who mentions this, many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. So you have not only at the resurrection of Jesus, you have not only the resurrection of Jesus, but he becomes the first fruit. That is, not just him, but these others also rise from the dead, indicating because he rose from the dead, we're going to rise too. And they are the pattern for us. And notice how they came out of the tombs and they appeared to many, and I don't know what happened to them after this, so we're not told. But his resurrection brings forth life. And Matthew goes on, verse 54, now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus. These are the ones who would place him on the cross. They're the ones that are there to make sure nobody takes him down off the cross, saves his life. When they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Notice how the centurion gets more spiritual insight than all of the Jewish leaders that were there. They were blinded, and he had his eyes opened as he makes a proclamation about the identity of Jesus that is correct. Truly, this was the Son of God. Now we turn to John chapter 19, and this is almost anticlimactic. The death of Jesus has taken place. Verse 31, when the Jews, because it was a day of preparation, notice the day of preparation for the Passover, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. It was a special day. It was a special day because it was a Passover, so it was a Passover plus it was a Sabbath. They asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other who was crucified with him. But coming to Jesus, when they saw he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Now there's an Old Testament prophecy that talks about this, about how not a bone of his would be broken. Verse 34, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. You see, they do want to make sure he's dead. When they were breaking the legs, that was to cause the death. That was to bring about the death, because apart from that, you just couldn't pull yourself up to get a breath of air, and it would cause asphyxiation on their part. But they came to Jesus, and they don't need to do that because he's already dead. But they want to make sure he's dead, not just pretending. So notice they pierce his side with a spear. They take a spear and they jam it up under his side. Of course, they're probably a bit lower than he is, so it would go up into him, piercing lungs and heart, and immediately blood and water came out. Now, I've been given to understand some medical issues of this, that the reason you have blood and water is because this would actually pierce the heart, and not only would the blood come out, but there would be this watery-looking substance that would come out. But I don't think that's the reason we're told this. I think that's a nice byproduct. But I think John mentions blood and water because of what it symbolizes. You see, the shedding of blood had brought about a cleansing that is symbolized by that which looks like water here. And water in John is used symbolically. Remember how John says to Nicodemus back in John chapter 3 and verse 5, that you must be born of water and spirit. And so that's being symbolized here by this act of the soldiers. Verse 35, and he who has seen this has testified. So the writer is saying, look, he's saying somebody saw this, and he's bearing witness, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, so that you may also believe. This is given as a sign for you to hear, to understand what he did on your behalf, and to believe. Now, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 19, gives a commentary on this. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats Notice, with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." Notice they were sprinkled in blood, but also with water. It's part of the ritual, the cleansing ritual that Jesus brought about in his own body. John 19:36. For these things came to pass to fulfill the scripture, and now we have a number of the passages mentioned that indicate this. Not a bone of him shall be broken. And again, another scripture says, they shall look upon him, they shall look on him whom they pierced. Here's the passage in Psalm 34 that talks about his bones. Many of the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones. Not one of them is broken. Now, if you read Psalm 34 in its context, you might not even think of that as a prophetic passage. It's one of those non-predictive passages that's describing how God saves the righteous. But Jesus fulfills even those that were not evidently prophetic. He still fulfills the scriptures. And likewise, Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10, where the Lord is speaking to the people through the prophet Zechariah, and he says, I will pour out on the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so they will look on me whom they have pierced. Notice it's the Lord doing this. And yet the Lord had been pierced. And notice, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. Where they see and they understand, oh my goodness, what have we done? And when I say what have we done, I'm not just speaking about Jewish people. I look at my own sins and I look at the cross and I say, oh my goodness, John, what have I done? Because my sins placed him there. Luke 23 and verse 50, and a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man, he had not consented to their plan and action. Notice there were those who were on the Sanhedrin, those on the council, who were in the minority, who had not wanted to see Jesus crucified, who had not passed that judgment. It was not a unanimous affair. There was a majority opinion and a minority opinion. Notice a man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God, and this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had ever laid. This is why I said I don't think that the garden tomb is the tomb in which Jesus was laid, because there's evidence to show that tomb actually existed before the first century. It's older than that, and was likely used older than that. But this was a new tomb where no one had ever laid. Now, what would take place in that day, that you'd have a tomb, and the body would be set forth. In fact, you can see a sort of a stone slab in the back, sort of the center back. And that's where a body would be laid. And then later on, after the body had decomposed, people would return and they would collect the bones. And once it had decomposed, they would place those bones into what you see here. Notice these various boxes. These are called ossuaries. You have some regular size ossuaries. They're not all that big. There's nobody standing in the picture, so it's hard to see. But they're big enough to hold the largest bones in the human body. The longest bone in the human body is the thigh bone. And so they're long enough to hold that. Notice there's a smaller ossuary. That's for an infant. That's an ossuary into which you'd place a baby who had been maybe born and died in childbirth or very soon thereafter. And so Jesus was going to be laid in a tomb, probably with the intent, this was the custom in that day, that eventually many months or even a year or two afterward, they would go back and they would collect the bones and place them into an ossuary. Here's a picture of a first century tomb. Now, this isn't the tomb of Jesus. This is actually a tomb in Galilee, but it gives a picture of what that looked like with a big, giant rolling stone. And remember, a tomb, it wasn't a spacious room. It wasn't meant as a living room or something like that, but it was big enough where you could go in. You might have to bend over to go in. Wasn't a little less than head high. Um, and then once the body was interred, then a stone, in this case, a big rolling stone. They didn't always use rolling stones, but the New Testament speaks about that tomb, the stone being rolled into place. And that's what takes place here. The stone is rolled into place, and Jesus is sealed in the tomb. Verse 39, Nicodemus, who had first come to him by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. So they took the body of Jesus and wrapped it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Notice Nicodemus had come to Jesus by night and had been sort of a seeker, a wondering, he had, is this real? But now Nicodemus has come, I think, as a disciple. He's come now as a believer, and yet I don't think he fully understands what's going to take place. He's preparing the body, he thinks, for it to be interred, for it to be there for many months and maybe years, not realizing that in just a few days, Sunday's coming and a resurrection is about to take place.